birds are chirping, the wind is blowing, there are flowers. So why don't we talk about witches? Today's topic I've called In League with the Devil. And it is a discussion of witchcraft and witchcraft panics in colonial New England. We here in this region of the United States live in a very historical area. You can't walk down the street without tripping over some sort of history. And one of the most infamous episodes in our history as a nation, as a region, as a state, of course, has to do with witches. When you think of witches in North America, what do you think of? You probably think of that, right? Salem. And the infamous Salem Witch Trials, which take place in 1692. Now, Salem is celebrated, I guess that might be the poor word choice, but it is the most famous of the witch hysterias, the witch panics that break out in colonial North America, particularly here in the Northeast in New England. But it is certainly not the only one, and it is certainly not the first one. So we'll end our discussion by looking at the Salem Witch Trials, but we have to build up to the Salem Witch Trials and talk about what came before and the tradition of the belief in witchcraft and the tradition of witchcraft persecutions here in New England. So let's talk about witchcraft. What is witchcraft? It's something we all know, but something we can't really define, right? Witchcraft involves, well, in certain ways, it involves knowing how to use herbs, how to use natural products to solve problems. We were just having a discussion. Witches, folk healers, if we want to use that term, often knew how to grow garden herbs to, cure the pain of a toothache, to put on a sunburn, to ease the pain on a sunburn. They used herbs, they used natural products for those sort of medicinal purposes. But does that sound like witchcraft? No, because what the good witches, let's go Wizard of Oz here, right? You have your good witches and you have your bad witches. And what's the difference? Casting spells. Certainly part of the popular mythology of witchcraft. The interesting thing about witchcraft and this use of folk medicine and these ideas of kind of healing and secret knowledge is that those ideas and people who were adept at those things have been around for as long as human societies have been around. Going back to ancient times, to Babylon, to the Assyrians, to the Egyptians, there were people who had certain knowledge that was considered almost magical. And this tradition of folk healing and folk knowledge is certainly something that was common, not just in the Western world, but really around the world. There were people in all societies who had access to secret ideas and secret knowledge. What we see here on the screen are actually a bunch of early modern depictions of witches in various stages and various forms and various ideas of witches. Now, what is it that leads to witches being associated with evil?
Politics.
Politics is a good way of putting it. Politics. The association of witches, these folk healers, that should pop back up in a second. There it is. Magic. These folk healers with a sense of evil has to do with changing perceptions of society and social structure and growing complexity in particularly Western European society. Because the early colonists here in New England were from Old England, their ideas were very much shaped by cultural traditions in the homeland. And their ideas about witchcraft, their ideas about magic, their ideas about evil were shaped by cultural traditions from Western Europe, from England itself. And what we begin to see by the time we get to the late Middle Ages, the early modern period, is that many of these people who had previously been respected because of their secret knowledge, because of their knowledge of folk medicine, begin to be suspected of having this knowledge through perhaps nefarious means, by maybe abandoning the dominant religion, Christianity, for other secret faiths, for other secret ideas. And what we really see is that the belief in witches and the belief in witchcraft being associated with evil starts to become tremendously, tremendously closely associated with suspicion, superstition, and fear. And that starts to emerge by the time we get to about the 1300s. Now, if we think about the 14th century, what's going on in Europe during the 14th century? The Black Death, the plague. The 14th century is a terrible time to be alive, basically, particularly in Western Europe, because in the middle of the century you have the outbreak of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that spreads across Europe. It kills somewhere between a third to half of the European population. That is terrifying. You also have, during this time period, religious strife. You have, at one point, 3 different men claiming to be the Pope of the Western Church, each claiming to be the voice of God. You have endemic warfare across the European continent. The 100 Years' War breaks out during this period. You have peasant rebellions. The 14th century was chaotic. It was destructive. It was full of upheaval. And as that upheaval begins to settle down somewhat, there is a change in society. The people that survived all of that turmoil were restructuring the world around them. And people who did not fit into that newly restructured world, who were maybe on the edges of society or didn't conform to societal norms, were often considered to be perhaps a little bit off, perhaps a little bit evil. And when you combine that with the superstition and with the endemic fear that was around, suddenly those outsiders, those cranky old people that were living in the edge of the woods, the people that dressed weird or maybe wore hats when nobody else was wearing hats and that sort of stuff, become suspicious. And you see this growing concern about their behavior. By the time we get to the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, there is this growing association between those outsiders, those with this secret knowledge, and a belief that witches were in league with the devil, that they had turned their back on God, had turned their back on Christianity, and were instead forming an alliance, a partnership with Satan. And that idea of abandoning Christianity and embracing the devil is really at the key to the transformation of the idea of witchcraft itself. Now, what does that mean? Witches during this time period, the early modern period, were often believed to have turned their back on the church and instead formed a secret pact with the devil, essentially selling their soul for secret powers, for secret knowledge to Satan. We see some images of that going on over here. They would employ magical means, supernatural means, to harm their enemies, to transform themselves into wild animals. Sometimes witches were assumed to have what was called a domestic, an animal spirit that lived with them. The association of witches with black cats, for example. Why are witches associated with black cats? Why are black cats associated with witches? Because it was thought that the black cat kind of embodied the evilness that was the witch itself. You have all of this going on in this changing society in Western Europe, this growing superstition, this growing fear of the unknown. As these ideas are developing, there are certain attributes that become very much associated with those suspected of witchcraft. One was that they would gather in the woods to dance and fornicate with the devil, the infamous witches' Sabbath. We see that depicted over here. There was also the belief that witches could fly through the sky on a stick or on a broom. Again, think of our Wizard of Oz and the witch flying through the sky. We see that depicted over there. How could they do that? Well, it was obviously the devil or demons helping them fly through the sky. And there was, of course, the fact that at these witches' Sabbaths, one of the acts that was done was the desecration of the holy books of Christianity. We see that going on over there, a baptism in blood, if you will, which makes a really good heavy metal record title. So there was this growing suspicion, there was this growing fear, this fear of the supernatural, this fear of the unknown. And the people that were suspected of cavorting with the devil were often those who were marginalized in society, who were on the fringes of organized society. Again, you know, the little old woman who lived in the cabin at the edge of the woods, who maybe knew a little bit about herbal medicine. Can we actually trust her? She's a little bit different. She has secret knowledge. Perhaps she's in league with the devil. So you had this fear of witches that is manifesting itself across Western Europe. Now, what could you do to protect yourself from witches or from evil? Well, you could try to find counter spells. You could wear a cross, but the cross was not really a powerful enough symbol to stop witchcraft evil. You could try. I grew up in a Sicilian house. My grandmother was Sicilian. My mother was Sicilian. There was a belief in the evil eye. And how do you protect yourself from the evil eye? Right? You ward it off with hand gestures. Any of you who are Italian or know Italians are familiar with that. But there were, you know, in England, they didn't have the evil eye. But what they did have were other mechanisms for defending yourself from witchcraft, from evil, including the production of so-called witch bottles, which we see over here. Now, what are witch bottles and how did they work? Well, essentially, if you felt that you had been, a spell had been cast against you, you could figure out a way to counter that magic by stuffing various objects into one of these jugs and then hiding it in a hole in the wall, digging a hole and burying it under the ground as a form of warding off the evil. Oftentimes what was included in these witch jugs were herbs, were other plant matter, sometimes the hair of the person who was cursed. You'd pluck some hairs, you'd stick them in there, and oftentimes they were filled with urine. So you had these various objects that were placed into these witch bottles. The witch bottles themselves were then stored, were then hidden, and they were meant to protect the home. They were meant to protect the individual from further curses, from further affliction by witches. Other ways in which people sought to protect themselves from evil and from witchcraft were by burying cats under their doorstep. Why a cat? Well, a cat associated with witches, associated with the devil. You take the cat, you dig a hole, you bury it under your doorstep. That was believed to protect you from evil from outside. It was meant to protect your house. Sometimes you would use a horseshoe. We all know the lucky horseshoe, right? That is associated with warding off evil from witchcraft. So there were various mechanisms that people embraced to try to protect themselves from the unknown, from the supernatural, from the spells that were cast upon them by witches. As the belief in the evil of witches becomes more deeply entrenched in Europe and becomes more widespread in Europe, we do begin to see witch panics breaking out across Europe and witch persecutions taking place across Europe. People who were suspected of wrongdoing, of being in league with the devil, were often pursued and persecuted and tried and often executed for the suspicion of witchcraft. And by the time we get to the late 15th century, 1487 or thereabouts, there is actually a witch hunting guide that is published in Germany. It's called the Malleus Maleficarum, which translates to the Hammer of the Witches. It was a guide that was written originally by Heinrich Kramer, later had some additions by Jacob Sprenger, on how to pursue witches, how to identify witches, how to basically end witches. It was a text that becomes very popular, becomes very widespread across Europe. In its original Latin, you can buy modern translations of it if you are interested in taking a look at the Malleus Maleficarum today. But what we see is that the belief in witches becomes very much cemented, and the struggle to contain witchcraft, if you will, is very much codified in texts like this and other witch hunting guides that are developed. Now, this is published on the continent, in continental Europe, but the ideas contained within it do make their way to England. And it is in England where our story really begins, because, again, the New Englanders were colonists coming from England. In the middle of the 17th century, we do see the rise of an infamous witch hunter in England itself, Matthew Hopkins, who assumed the title of Witchfinder General. A title he made up. It wasn't an official title in England, but he called himself the Witchfinder General. And what he does in the 1640s in eastern England is he goes on and essentially hires himself out to local communities and individuals to hunt down witches, to hunt down evil in their communities. You remember the movie Ghostbusters? They're hired to go and fight ghosts. Matthew Hopkins was kind of doing the same thing with suspected witches in 17th century England. Let's say you are a farming community and all of a sudden all of the sheep in your community fall ill. What causes that? It must be witches. So how do we solve this? How do we find who caused this? Let's bring in Matthew Hopkins. We'll pay him a little bit of money, and he will go around interrogating people and asking questions and identifying who was the cause of this. Now, how did he do that? How did he determine who was witches? He had a variety of techniques. Let's say our sheep are dead over here and we think it was you because you're an outsider, you're living on the edge of the community, you don't get along well with your neighbors. So I come along, the witch hunter, and I knock on your door and you open the door and I drag you out into the sun and I start poking at you and examining you to see if you have any weird marks on you, moles or birthmarks or anything like that, things that might be the mark of the devil. If I can't find any of those, I could resort to what was called trial by water. And how does trial by water work? Let's say I suspect you of being a witch. How can I test that? Well, I will tie you up, tie your legs and your hands together, and throw you into a lake. Now, if you sink, it means you were not a witch. Because you were pure and the water is accepting you, the water that reflects baptism. However, if I throw you into the lake and you float at the surface, the water of baptism is rejecting you and obviously you are a witch. It's pretty much a lose-lose proposition in that case. But what we see is that Matthew Hopkins used techniques like this, going around and examining for weird marks on the body, looking at moles and birthmarks and poking at things, and throwing people into the water and other unusual forms of torture to determine whether or not somebody was a witch. And he was tremendously effective in what he did. Between 1644 and 1647, he identified some 230 witches, including several members of the Anglican clergy. So he becomes renowned for his witch-finding skills. He actually does publish a guide called The Discovery of Witches. Here's a depiction of Matthew Hopkins, and here he is finding the witches, asking the questions and kind of seeing the familiar animals and that sort of stuff. So the English in the 17th century were very much involved in this idea of witchcraft being associated with evil, witchcraft being associated with the devil, and undermining Christianity and all that sort of stuff. So what does that mean for us here in New England? Well, those early English colonists, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, came from this tradition of the belief in witches, and they brought that with them here to the New World, to New England. Now, life in early New England was not easy. You were arriving in the wilderness. You had no infrastructure. There were very few resources available to you. You had to make your way through the wilds of New England. You had dramatic weather, hot summers, cold winters, unpredictable rain, and that sort of stuff. Agriculture was tremendously hard. There were many, many hardships that those early Puritan settlers, these guys, faced when they arrived here in New England. And sometimes things did not go well. Crops failed. Animals died. Children died in infancy or childbirth. There were all sorts of problems, not uncommon in the 17th century, but certainly sort of amplified here in colonial New England a place that seemed isolated, that seemed remote from the rest of the world. So there was among these Puritans, these God-fearing Puritans, a belief that the devil did influence what happened in the mortal realm, and that it wasn't just God that was controlling things, but Satan certainly played a role in the evil that happened. And what does that ultimately lead to? Well, it leads to suspicions of witchcraft. Now, where were the first witchcraft trials and first witchcraft panics held? Here in New England? It's not Salem. It's not even Boston. It's actually in Connecticut. Connecticut is established as a colony in 1636. It's established by people who were escaping Massachusetts, for lack of a better term. And they established their own Puritan colony along the banks of the Connecticut River. So 1636, we have the establishment of the Connecticut colony. Within 6 years, the Connecticut Colonial Legislature passes a law, which we see over here. I'll read it to you if you can't make that out. It says, if any man after legal conviction shall have or worship any other god but the Lord God, he shall be put to death. The Puritans are very embracing of people. Number 2 there says, if any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath or consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. What we see in Connecticut with this piece of legislation is the idea that witchcraft was a capital offense. If you were accused of witchcraft, convicted of witchcraft, you could be put to death by the power of the government, the colonial government.
Women that could be witchcraft.
No. Anybody who was in league with the devil could be suspected of witchcraft. Of course, what are male witches called? Today we call them warlocks, but they were still considered to be in league with the devil, still considered to be evil, if you will. So it is with the passage of this law in 1642 in the Connecticut colony that we see the codification, the cementing of the idea of the evilness of witches here in New England. And it is in Connecticut, a few years after this law is passed, that the first witch accusation and witch trial is held. That is the trial of Alice Young. Her name is sometimes spelled Alce Young and has a couple of other variations, but it's Alice Young, who lived in Windsor. Windsor is the English settlement just north of Hartford. In the 17th century, the Connecticut colony was basically 3 towns: Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. All 3 of them have experiences with witchcraft during this time period. So Alce Young is accused of witchcraft in Windsor, and she is put on trial in Hartford, the colonial capital. She is found guilty of witchcraft and is executed outside of the meeting house. There you see a reconstruction of the original meeting house in Hartford, Connecticut. It's on the grounds of what is today the old State House. If you've ever been to Hartford, if you've ever driven through Hartford on I-91 or I-84, the old State House is an important public building from the late 18th century. So Alce Young is executed because of this accusation of witchcraft there in 1647, becoming the first accused witch here in North America, in British North America, and the first executed suspected witch in British North America. Now, when she dies, she leaves behind a husband and a young daughter. Somewhat ironically, her daughter, whose name was also Alice, 30 years later would also be accused of witchcraft in Springfield. But she would not stand trial and not be executed because of it. But you do have this kind of lineage there with Alce Young and her daughter and the accusations of witchcraft. So this is really the beginning of the witch hysteria, the witchcraft panic that we see in New England that ultimately culminates in Salem some 45 years later. So we have 4.5 decades of this kind of building up. Another suspected witch in Connecticut was a woman named Mary Johnson, who lived in Wethersfield. Now, I do have to kind of come clear with this. I grew up in Wethersfield. And there are a lot of colonial historical things that happen in that town, and I always kind of highlight what happens there because it's kind of close to my heart. But in the case of the witchcraft trials, Wethersfield does play an important role in that story in Connecticut. So a year after Alice Young's death, Mary Johnson was accused and ultimately convicted of witchcraft. Now, she had kind of a checkered past. She had worked as a servant in wealthy houses in Connecticut and in Wethersfield. And a few years prior, she had been accused of theft, stealing from the wealthy house owner. She denied those accusations and manages to go on with her life. But by 1648, she is once again in trouble with the authorities. This time, not only accused of theft, but accused of witchcraft. Now, to make matters worse for Mary Johnson, she is imprisoned because she's accused of theft. And while she's imprisoned, she is interviewed by a local minister. And that minister, perhaps using methods that we would find somewhat troubling today, manages to extract a confession from her. She says, while in prison, she confesses to the murder of a child and that she had been guilty of uncleanness with men and devils. She essentially confesses to all sorts of sins. Because of that, she is almost immediately convicted of her uncleanness with devils. She is convicted of witchcraft, but she is not executed right away. Why? Well, what happens when you have uncleanness with men sometimes? She's pregnant. She is pregnant. So the legal idea at the time was that you could not kill the mother because then you would also be taking the life of the innocent child. So she remained in prison until after her child was born. Then, after her child is born, in 1650, she does meet her fate at the gallows. Now, the story of Mary Johnson is actually picked up later on by the famous Puritan minister Cotton Mather. He writes a whole bunch of histories of New England and accounts of witchcraft. And what we see here is an excerpt from one of his works. He says there was one Mary Johnson tried at Hartford in this country upon an indictment of familiarity with the devil, and was found guilty thereof, chiefly upon her own confession. Her confession was attended with such convictive circumstances that it could not be slighted. So you have Mary Johnson, an accused thief, an accused adulterer who confesses to witchcraft as part of this saga, this growing accusation of witchcraft and spread of witch panic in Connecticut in the 1640s. Now, was Mary Johnson the last one? Of course not. There were several other people in Connecticut, in Wethersfield, in Hartford, and Windsor who are ultimately accused of witchcraft, and they all meet different fates. One couple from Wethersfield, the Carringtons, John and Joan Carrington, for example, were accused of witchcraft, tried and convicted in 1651. So this is only a few years after Mary Johnson. And they were both executed together, husband and wife, because of these accusations of witchcraft. That same year in Fairfield, Connecticut, kind of down in the southwest, a woman named Goodwife Bassett was executed. Now, in colonial New England, among the Puritans, you often see the title good wife or goody. That was kind of the same as Mrs., I guess we would say today. It was how you addressed people. So good wife or goody Bassett, accused of witchcraft, was executed in 1651. In 1653, another woman in Fairfield, a woman named Goodwife Knapp, met the same fate. She also was executed because of accusations of witchcraft. In 1654, the following year, in Windsor, a woman named Lydia Gilbert was accused and convicted of using witchcraft to cause mortal wounds to one of her creditors. She had apparently borrowed money. And you know how we feel when we borrow money. How am I going to get out of this? Well, I'll make a little spell, make a little potion, and the guy who I owe money to will fall grievously ill. it didn't work in her case because she is accused and convicted. Yet many of those who were accused in Connecticut were not convicted. Many of them managed to escape conviction. Many of them managed to flee the Connecticut colony. For example, in 1655, Nicholas Bailey and his wife were accused of witchcraft in New Haven. But they were absolved of that. They were found not guilty of witchcraft. And another New Havenite, William Meeker, was also accused and exonerated of witchcraft. He turns around and sues his accuser for slander. So you have all of these legal proceedings that are tied up with this notion of witchcraft and these witch trials and these witch accusations in Connecticut. For some people, it didn't go well, obviously. For others, they survived. They kind of fought back, if you will. So we see this spread of this fear of witches and this witchcraft panic and witch trials taking place in Connecticut. But was Connecticut the only place? Of course not. Where else did we have these crazy Puritans? Well, why don't we look at New Hampshire? And the witches in New Hampshire. There's one accused witch in New Hampshire who is perhaps the best known of the New Hampshire witches. She is called the Witch of Hampton, a woman whose name is Eunice Cole. Now, Eunice Cole was accused of witchcraft 3 separate times between 1656 and 1680. So she's accused 3 times. What can we assume, at least for the first 2 times? She survives those accusations of witchcraft. In fact, in 1656, with her first accusation of witchcraft, she is accused of causing people to fall ill, killing their animals in unusual ways, and various other troublemaking events to her neighbors and to the people in her community. She's actually tried in Boston in that year and convicted of familiarity with the devil. But she's not executed. She's imprisoned and she's whipped, but not executed. So eventually, after several years in prison, she is released and she goes back to her home. And what happens when she goes back to her home? Well, her neighbors don't like her, I guess we could say. And soon, in 1673, she is once again accused of witchcraft and once again stands trial for those accusations. Here we see some of the documents associated with her second trial. So this time, in 1673, she is accused of attempting to lure a young girl into living with her. She is also accused of taking various animal shapes and causing a neighbor's oven to produce foul-tasting bread. Now, she is exonerated from these charges. So she stands trial, but is not convicted here in 1673. But 7 years later, in 1680, what happens? She is again accused of witchcraft by her neighbors. Now, you have to imagine that Eunice Cole was perhaps a curmudgeonly figure, not popular with her neighbors, perhaps didn't attend the church services when she was supposed to, maybe, was damn kids, stay off my lawn type of person. So she was not very popular with her neighbors, and they were often accusing her of the troubles that were befalling them. So again, in 1680, she's accused of witchcraft, but this time she is again exonerated at trial. So she's got one conviction for witchcraft, 1 out of 3. I guess that's okay. And what happens? She actually dies peacefully in bed in 1680 after this last accusation of witchcraft. So I guess she showed her neighbors who had been bedeviling her, excuse the term, that she gets to die peacefully in bed. Now, one of the reasons why the Witch of Exeter is so famous is because John Greenleaf Whittier, great American poet, in the 1860s, writes kind of an epic poem about her and features her story in the poem The Wreck of Rivermouth. So Goody Cole is a character in this famous poem that is written in the 1860s, and that's why her story is well known, or more well-known than many other witchcraft accusations. So you have Eunice Cole surviving all of this trouble, all of these accusations. She does spend time in prison, but ultimately she dies peacefully asleep in her bed, as we all would hope to do. Is that the end of our witchcraft story, however? Of course not. Because even as Eunice Cole is standing trial and surviving those trials, back in Connecticut, in Hartford, we once again have the outbreak of another witchcraft panic, the so-called Hartford witch panic of the early 1660s. Now, what happens in this witch panic of the early 1660s? Well, it begins in 1662 when an 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly falls ill and suddenly dies. Her parents blamed a unpopular neighbor, a woman named Goody Ayers, of using magic to afflict their daughter. Now, why do they accuse Goody Ayers of doing that? Well, right before she died, Elizabeth Kelly, in kind of a feverish stupor, yells out to her father, "Father, father, help me, help me. Goodwife Ayers is upon me. She chokes me. She kneels on my belly. She will break my bowels. She pinches me. She will make me black and blue. Goodwife Ayers torments me. She pricks me with pins. She will kill me." It's an awful lot for an 8-year-old to be saying while she's dying, but, "Oh, father, set on the great furnace and scald her. Get the broad axe and cut off her head." That's a, pretty strong accusation from a girl who is ill and suddenly dies. So obviously the people in Hartford suspected that Goody Ayers might have been behind this. She's accused by the girl who was having these hallucinations. There we see the dramatic scene of young Miss Kelly dying, I guess. So what happens is Goody Ayers is arrested, put on trial, and convicted and executed of witchcraft. But this accusation sparks another round of panic in Hartford over the next year, between 1662 to 1663. About a dozen people will be tried for witchcraft in Hartford. 3 of them ultimately will be executed for accusations of witchcraft. Some of them manage to escape. They get accused of witchcraft and they pack up their stuff and get out of Connecticut. They go to New York or more tolerant places in the colonies. But what we see is this other round of witchcraft accusations taking place in Connecticut. Now, Connecticut's history with witchcraft starts early, but it also ends relatively early, because by the mid-1660s, many of the witchcraft panics that spring up in other parts of the colonies and other parts of New England don't happen in Connecticut. And why is that? Well, because as a reaction to the Hartford witchcraft panic and the stuff that had happened in Wethersfield earlier, the governor of Connecticut, John Winthrop Jr., basically institutes stricter rules for convicting people accused of witchcraft. Now, John Winthrop Jr. is a fascinating character in the 17th century. He was the son of John Winthrop, one of the founders of Massachusetts. He was a tremendously well-educated individual, a man who had what we would today call a scientific mind, who looked for the reasons why things happened, didn't rely on superstition, and didn't necessarily rely on religious explanations to explain how the world worked. He was inquisitive. He dabbled in alchemy because he wanted to see how things happened. He was a correspondent with some of the leading intellectuals in England. And when he becomes governor of Connecticut, he is very much concerned about these witchcraft accusations and the fact that people are being convicted by, an 8-year-old child saying that person's afflicting me. And people were being killed because of that. So what we see Winthrop doing is kind of changing how witchcraft trials were held in Connecticut and the type of evidence that was necessary to actually convict someone. One of the things he institutes is that he said, in order for somebody to be convicted of an accusation of witchcraft, there have to be 2 separate witnesses to the same act of witchcraft. So it wasn't enough that one person could say, "Oh, the witch is stabbing me." There had to be more than one eyewitness to that one act of witchcraft in order to convict somebody. What we see with the implementation of that is that suddenly there are no more witch executions in Connecticut. People were still accused of witchcraft, but it was very hard to convict somebody of that. So suddenly the bloodletting, if you will, in Connecticut, because of accusations of witchcraft, does come to an end. But is that the end of our story about witchcraft? Of course not. We haven't gotten to Salem yet. And the big deal there in Salem with the infamous Salem witch trials. Now, by the time the colonies get to the 1670s, 1680s, 1690s, there are profound changes taking place. There is turmoil that is tearing the colonies apart. The English population in New England is growing dramatically, but that brings that English population into conflict with the native population, which is feeling all sorts of pressures from the increasing presence of the English. And ultimately, what that leads to is the outbreak of war. King Philip's War in the 1670s is one of the bloodiest and most destructive wars in American history. Per capita, there are more fatalities during King Philip's War than there were during the American Civil War. It was a hugely traumatic episode for the English colonists and the native people here in New England. And it was a war that nearly extinguished the English colonial presence in New England. At the height of that war, it was dangerous for an Englishman to be beyond kind of 10 miles outside of Boston. If you were beyond that frontier, you were in danger. So King Philip's War was hugely, hugely traumatic for the English colonists. Of course, what happens in King Philip's War? Ultimately, the English defeat Philip and his Native American Confederacy. The Native American political presence in New England is largely extinguished at that point, and the English are free to expand across the region, which they do rapidly and readily at the end of King Philip's War. Still, the trauma of that conflict did leave scars in New England society. There's another traumatic episode about a decade later that will also impact New England society. And that was the creation of the Dominion of New England. Now, what was the Dominion of New England? Nobody remembers their early U.S. history, huh? The Dominion of New England was a plan implemented by the King of England, James II, to gain direct control over the American colonies. When the New England colonies are established, each colony had their own charter. So there was a Massachusetts Bay Charter, a Rhode Island Charter, a Connecticut Charter, a New Hampshire Charter. Each of those colonies was independent from the other. They were tied together culturally, obviously, but they had their own politics, their own relations with the native peoples, their own relations with one another. And they operated largely in independence from the crown in England. The English monarchy was happy as long as taxes were coming from here or trade was coming from here to England. James II, who was a tremendously unpopular king in England, wanted to gain more control of the colonies. So what he does in 1686 is he essentially attempts to unify all of the northern colonies into one super colony called the Dominion of New England. That included New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and parts of northern New Jersey. One super colony controlled directly by a royally appointed governor, who was a guy named Edmund Andros, very unpopular. So the king was trying to strip away the basic charters, the basic ideas of these individual colonies into this one super colony, and the colonists themselves hated that. And they did everything they could to resist the Dominion of New England, to resist Edmund Andros. Now, one of the reasons why the colonists were particularly unhappy was that the new arrival governor, Andros, was an Anglican. And what were most of the New Englanders? But Puritans. And the Puritans didn't like the Anglicans. The Anglicans thought the Puritans were ridiculous. So you have that religious tension behind there, but also a political tension. So you have this social trauma there. King Philip's War, the Dominion of New England. Ultimately, the Dominion does fail because in 1688, James II is chased from the throne in England, this glorious revolution. And he is forced to leave England, and a new monarch is put on the throne there. William and Mary become the rulers of England. Now, what does that have to do with witchcraft? Nothing directly, but the trauma of those events, the turmoil that they caused, the fear of King Philip's War, the political uncertainty of the Dominion of New England certainly meant that the social situation in New England was unstable. It was uncertain. There was suspicion. There was fear. That was a field. And all of that ultimately culminates here in Salem. Now, how many of you have been to Salem? Yeah. Salem today makes a fortune on the witchcraft industry. You go to the witch museums and the witch houses, and Halloween in Salem is supposedly insane. I've never been, but I hear it's ridiculous to get into the city because everybody's there dressed in their pointy hats with their capes and stuff like that. But the story of the Salem witch trials actually doesn't take place in what is today Salem. It takes place in Danvers. Now, why is that? It's because in the late 17th century, Salem was actually two entities. You had Salem town, what is today Salem, over by the water. And then you had the countryside part over here, which was Salem Village, today's Danvers. It is there in Salem Village where the turmoil of the witch trials actually begin. It is there in Salem Village where the controversy that sparks the series of accusations has its origins. And it is really one particular person who is kind of, I don't want to call him responsible for the outbreak of the witch trials, but is certainly the lightning rod that attracts the turmoil that sparks those accusations. That is this man, the Reverend Samuel Parris, and his house that we see there. Now, what was the controversy surrounding Samuel Parris? Well, the controversy had to do with the fact that the people in Salem Village were relatively isolated from Salem town. Yet it was Salem town where all of the churches were located. It was in Salem town where political business took place. And the farmers out in Salem Village felt isolated and felt removed. And it was a problem for them to make their way to Salem town during for church services. So they petitioned to have a church established in Salem Village. Now, that petition is granted. A church is established in Salem Village. But once you have a church, what else do you need? You need a minister. So they have to hire a minister, and the person that is hired in Salem Village is Samuel Parris. Now, Parris arrives in Salem Village, and as any Puritan minister, he was supported by the community. That meant that the farmers of Salem Village brought firewood, they brought crops, they essentially paid for the upkeep of the house and the church and the upkeep of the minister himself. So Samuel Parris is hired, he settles down there in Salem Village in this very nice house, and then he starts to tell his neighbors, his congregants, hey, I need more stuff. I need more food, I need more firewood, I need to live in a better style. And there's a growing sense of resentment against Samuel Parris. So he becomes kind of an unpopular figure, a troublesome figure, I guess we could say, in Salem Village itself. And that kind of antagonism and animosity by many of the people in Salem toward Samuel Parris is really part of the background of where the Salem witch trials begin. Now, what is the event that actually sparks the witch hysteria, the witch panic in Salem? It has to do with the household of Samuel Parris, and particularly his daughter, who we will see in a second, hopefully. There we go. Her name was Betty, or Elizabeth. Betty, in February of 1692, began to exhibit odd symptoms, kind of thrashing on the floor, foaming at the mouth, speaking in tongues, really unusual behavior. Soon, a couple of other girls begin to exhibit similar behavior. The local physician is brought in to examine, to see if he can figure out what's going on. And of course, he has no knowledge. Remember, 17th century medicine was not so good. So the doctor examines the girls and says there's nothing physically wrong with them. Well, what could possibly be causing this behavior, these kind of convulsions and this foaming at the mouth and the tearing of their clothing and that sort of thing? What could it possibly be? Must be witchcraft. It must be some form of evil that has befallen these girls. So what happens? The doctor and Samuel Parris begin to question the girls. What is going on? Is somebody hurting you? And what do the girls say? Well, they say, yeah, we are being afflicted. We are being afflicted by three women, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne. Now, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were, again, widows who lived on the fringes of society. They had unpleasant interactions with Samuel Parris and with the Parris family. There were disputes over, your dog pooped in my yard type stuff, and, that kind of difficulty in the relationship. And they also accused a servant, a slave in the house of Samuel Parris named Tituba, who had come from the Caribbean islands. There we see an unflattering depiction of Tituba. And they accuse them, those three women, of causing them turmoil. Now, what happens? Of course, the three women are essentially gathered up. They are brought and questioned. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne deny that they are witches, but Tituba says, yeah, I taught the girls some spells from what I learned back in the Caribbean. I taught them some things to make some potions and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, the specter of witchcraft becomes very real in Salem. And from those initial accusations, what we begin to see is that the girls, now the center of attention, begin to accuse other people in the community of afflicting them, of causing them turmoil, of causing them pain. And soon, more and more and more people are accused of witchcraft in Salem. Ultimately, more than 200 people would be accused of witchcraft in and around Salem. Now, how did that happen? Let's say I accuse you of being a witch. You show up in my room at night and you're afflicting me. You're pinching me and bruising me and that sort of thing. And you are brought and are essentially thrown in jail. How do you save yourself? Well, you can deny being a witch, but that's what we would expect of a witch, right? They're not going to say that they are. Or you could say, no, I'm not a witch, but I know who is. And you start pointing out the neighbors you have problems with. So you see this growing circle of accusations as this panic begins to spread. And more people are brought in, more and more people are accused of witchcraft, more and more people are arrested and imprisoned and questioned. So the situation in Salem grows very, very quickly, from the household of Samuel Parris to many, many more people being arrested, being imprisoned, being interrogated about their evilness and their cavorting with the devil. But how do we know if somebody's a witch? Well, remember our good friend Matthew Hopkins back in England? There were methods, and one of the methods was by examination. So many of the people that were accused of witchcraft were physically examined to see if they had unusual marks on their body, marks that could be considered the mark of the devil. If you had like a weirdly shaped mole or something like that, it could be considered a nipple to suckle demons with. That sort of thing. So you have the physical examination and pointing out of scars and blemishes on your body. That could be strong evidence that you were, in fact, a witch. So what we see is that in Salem, the magistrates begin to try to handle this growing circle of accusations. They begin to examine and try to determine who's guilty and who's innocent in terms of witchcraft. They're arresting people. These accusations are spreading, going from person to person. People are trying to save themselves by accusing other people. And you have this kind of cascade of witchcraft fear that permeates Salem society. Now, one of the tools that eventually emerges in Salem as a way of determining whether or not somebody was a witch was a type of evidence that is called spectral evidence. Now, what is spectral evidence? And how does it work? Spectral evidence would not stand a legal challenge today, I guess we could say. How it worked was that if I accused somebody of being a witch and I am brought in front of the magistrates and they're asking me questions about who I thought was a witch, and that person shows up in the room, is brought into the room, suddenly I fall on the ground and I scream in pain that so-and-so, let's say Goody Osgood, is afflicting me. She is causing me pain. Can't you see her causing me pain? Like we see depicted over here. It was evidence that was, spectral. It was ghostly. You could not see it, but the accusers reacted in a specific way This spectral evidence becomes one of the foundations on which convictions are established in Salem during this panic. So the use of spectral evidence becomes very, very significant in the Salem witch trials. Now let's think back to what I was talking about a couple minutes ago and what was going on in Connecticut with John Winthrop Jr. What does John Winthrop Jr. do in Connecticut with the witch courts there? He essentially gets rid of the idea of spectral evidence, says you have to have two witnesses. That does not happen in Salem, at least not yet. Spectral evidence does become one of the foundations for accusations and convictions of ideas of witchcraft. So you have all of this turmoil growing in Salem, and all of these accusations of witchcraft. The local magistrates, the ministers are kind of all overwhelmed with this, and ultimately, what happens? The colony itself, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, determines that they have to kind of set up a formal court to investigate these accusations of witchcraft. So in May of 1692, a court of oyer and terminer is established by the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, William Phipps. Judges and scholars are sent to Salem to examine those who are accused of witchcraft. The lead magistrate of this was the lieutenant governor of the colony, William Stoughton, who we see over there. They later name a town after him. Some of the other important judges included Samuel Sewell, John Richards, Waite Winthrop. There's a lot of towns named after these guys, actually. Peter Sargent, John Corwin, John Hawthorne. He has a descendant who becomes a novelist. Bartholomew Gedney and Nathaniel Saltonstall. All of these men were empowered by the colonial governor to go and participate in the investigation of these witches and these witchcraft accusations in Salem itself. And what happens? Well, the Court of Oyer and Terminer comes into session in May. People who are accused of witchcraft are dragged before the court. They are examined. They are questioned. The supposed victims of witchcraft are brought in as witnesses. And many of those accused of witchcraft are ultimately convicted. Convicted on the basis of spectral evidence. Ultimately, some 19 individuals are convicted of witchcraft in the Salem Witchcraft Trials and are ultimately executed. Some of those who are accused, before they are hanged — we don't burn witches in America, by the way, we hang them — before they are hanged, give passionate declarations of their innocence to the assembled crowd. One, a Mr. Burroughs — I'm going to read you a description of what Mr. Burroughs says from a history of the witch trials. Mr. Burroughs was carried in a cart with others through the streets of Salem to execution. When he was upon the ladder, he made a speech for the clearing of his innocency, with such solemn and serious expressions as were to the admiration of all present. His prayer, which he concluded by repeating the Lord's Prayer, was so well worded and uttered with such composedness, as such fervency of spirit, as was very affecting, and drew tears from many, so that it seemed to some that the spectators would hinder the execution. People were going to the gallows professing their innocence, stating, "I am not a witch, I am not in league with the devil, I am innocent." But those professions of innocence there at the gallows were kind of too little too late. They had been accused, they had been convicted, and they were about to meet their fate there on the gallows. Now, one of the big historical questions that people have looked for the answer to for many, many years was, where did the executions in Salem actually take place? Recent scholarship has determined that the location of the gallows in Salem is a place called Proctor's Ledge. Here we see a depiction of Proctor's Ledge with Salem down there in the background. It was here at Proctor's Ledge, kind of on the outskirts of Salem itself, where the accused, where the convicted of the Salem witch trials were ultimately brought to their death, were executed on the gallows. So 19 accused witches in Salem are ultimately executed by hanging. There is a 20th person who dies, however, in Salem. A man named Giles Corey. Giles Corey is accused of witchcraft, but when he is brought in for trial, he refuses to answer whether or not he is a witch. The judges ask him, and he says, I'm not answering. So the magistrates determine to force him to answer. And what do they do to Giles Corey to try to extract an answer from him? They decide to crush him with rocks, laying more and more rocks upon him until he answers the accusation. Each time they asked him, however, he refused to answer. And ultimately, Giles Corey is crushed to death. Now, Giles Corey was in his late 80s at the time he was accused of witchcraft, but he resisted the accusations. He refused to answer the accusations and ultimately meets his demise by being crushed under piles of stone. He is another one of the victims of the Salem Witchcraft Trials. There are also 5 accused witches who die in prison. But ultimately, what happens in Salem? As the accusations begin to spread, as the executions begin to increase in number, some of the people that are accused of witchcraft are no longer within the Salem community. Those accusations begin to spread to other parts of Massachusetts. And what we see is that by late summer of 1692, there are people who are well connected in the Massachusetts Bay Colony who are being accused of witchcraft, including, by some accounts, the governor's wife. Well, what happens when that occurs? The governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phipps, that's a terribly pixelated image of him, excuse me for that, says, you know what? I don't get along well with my wife either, but I'm pretty sure she's not a witch. And he ultimately ends the court of Oyer and Terminer. He brings a sudden, immediate end to the witchcraft trials in Salem. Well, what does that mean for those 200 people that were imprisoned and accused of witchcraft? Well, they're still in prison and accused of witchcraft. It would be several months before they are eventually released, and many of them are exonerated. By the time we get to the spring of 1793, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is essentially waking up to a bad hangover from the Salem witch trials. People are kind of looking at each other going, what was that? What was going on there? And many of the key participants in the witch trials begin to look for forgiveness for their role that they played. One of those who asks for forgiveness was none other than Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, and an important figure in late 17th, early 18th century Massachusetts. He actually publicly begs for forgiveness 5 years after the witch trials in 1697. In a letter that is read to the South Church congregation in Boston, he says, or the letter is read, Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has an unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all other sins, personal and relative. He begs the congregation, he begs the people of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for forgiveness for his role in the Salem witch trials. He is not alone in doing this. Some of the girls that are the first circle of accusations also make public acts of contrition, begging for forgiveness for their role in the Salem witch trials. And ultimately, the colony does try to put this episode behind them. Now, why are the Salem witch trials so famous? It's because of the intensity of them. More people are killed in Salem during a 4-month period of the Salem witch trials than are killed in the rest of the witch panics throughout New England over the long course of colonial history. So it was an intense period of broadening accusations, an intense period of legal action, of sanctioned executions that kind of amplifies what happened there in Salem. We don't remember Alice Young because she was kind of by herself there in Hartford, but we remember the victims of the Salem witch trials because there were so many in such a short period of time. Well, ultimately, what happens? The Salem Witch Trials becomes kind of an episode that is studied by historians for generations. There are still people writing books about the Salem Witch Trials. One of the reasons we were able to do that is because the historical record for it is very, very rich. All of the legal documents still exist. You can go to the Commonwealth Archives in Boston and read the trial papers from the Salem Witch Trials. We know who the victims were. We know what the accusations were. We know how everything happened. And we have the fact that in the aftermath, people were begging forgiveness for what had occurred there. It seems like a blip on the radar of colonial Massachusetts and colonial New England. Ultimately, Salem does make amends to those that were executed, sort of, as much as they could. In 2017, on the 325th anniversary of the Salem Witch Trials, a memorial is ultimately created at Proctor's Ledge in Salem to commemorate those who lost their lives during that witch hysteria. It took a while, but it eventually got there. So what we see in the period of colonial New England is very much a firm belief in witchcraft, and that firm belief combining with fear, combining with uncertainty, leading to these witch panics, these witch hysterias, these witch trials across New England. Not just Salem, but in New Hampshire, in Connecticut. There were some that take place in New York, but it was really kind of a snapshot of the uncertainty of life, the superstition of that time period, and it does become an important story in our collective American history. And that is the story of people being in league with the devil. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
Has there been any analysis of the mental status of the people who are accused of being witches with respect to major psychiatric disorders?
There have been people who have attempted. The question was, has there been any attempt to kind of understand the mental conditions of the people accused of witchcraft? Historians have tried to put that puzzle together. Of course, the evidence we have is very, it doesn't allow us to have good insight into that. There are also people who have questioned what caused the girls to start this cycle of accusations. And there are a whole bunch of different theories about that. One of the big theories is that in colonial New England, what role did 12-year-old girls have in society? None. They were essentially invisible. Now, all of a sudden, these girls, all about 12 or 13, that start having these accusations, leveling these accusations, they become the stars. People are paying attention to them. People are paying attention to what they say. And could that have fed the accusations that they were leveling? Could that have played a role in the spread of the circle of accusations? It's a theory. We could probably never get to a definitive answer about that, though.
Was there any, official apology, to clear the victims of this?
Many of the descendants of those who were accused of witchcraft have petitioned the legislature for getting their ancestors' names cleared, and there have been pieces of legislation that have gone through the state legislature to revoke the convictions of many of those who were accused. So, yes.
I understand that Samuel Sewell was the only magistrate that asked for forgiveness.
Yep.
But the other four, they still stood by their convictions.
Samuel Sewell does have kind of a sense of propriety in that he does ask for forgiveness. Some of the participants in the witch trials, people like Cotton Mather, for example, insisted that witches were there, that Satan was at play. In fact, in 1693, he writes a text called Wonders of the Invisible World, which is essentially a defense of the Salem witch trials. He insists that the devil was at play in New England. So different participants have different reactions, but Samuel Sewell does beg for forgiveness.
He was very successful until these. By the time he died, he was penniless.
His reputation does take a hit. Yes.
Not a question, but a story. So I'm a descendant of Susanna Martin.
Okay.
Who was hung in Salem.
Yep.
In July of
1692.
1992.
All right. One last question, and then I'll stick around a little bit.
husband's grandmother was a descendant of Mary Easty, that was one of the Salem witches.
So thank you for joining me, and I will see you next time.